All right, so we've now got a little better understanding of what causes inflation. Inflation, generally speaking, is caused by an increase in the money supply, or money supply growing faster than real GDP is. So you might be asking, well, what's the difference, right? So inflation is 1%, it's 20%. Doesn't in particular matter to me. Well, let's think about, in this learning objective, what are some of the costs and benefits of inflation? And in this, I mean in particular to society, so to the economy as a whole. So inflation will affect individuals differently. And that's one part of it, right? So generally speaking, if I am a borrower, inflation is good for me. So we talked previously about the relationship between real and nominal interest rates. And so inflation in this sense is good for me as a borrower. It reduces my cost of borrowing the money. Now, as a lender, it's the opposite case. So for a lender, inflation is bad for me. Because I'm lending out money and I'm getting the payments back in the future. But because of inflation, the price level increasing, that payment that I'm getting from the loan isn't worth as much. So inflation affects these individuals differently. And so, you also have people on fixed incomes. So retirees and these types of people, they're going to be harmed by inflation. So, inflation affects particular individuals differently than others, and that's there. But what I really want to focus on is to society at large, so to the entire economy. How does inflation affect us? There's two main costs to inflation. One is simply the logistical costs of dealing with it. So inflation implies that prices are going up, meaning they're changing. And that means I have to change the prices of the things I'm charging very frequently. So we have something that we refer to in economics called menu costs. And that's what we're referring to here. So where does this term menu cost come from? It's actually a great example of this phenomenon, which is a restaurant. So if I own a restaurant, the prices of my good are available on the printed menu. Now, every time I change my prices, I have to print a new menu for the restaurant. That incurs some cost to me. The more frequently prices change, the more frequently I have to change my menu, the higher the cost. So you imagine these hyperinflations where prices double every few days in the really bad hyperinflations. That's a lot of work for me as a business owner. In order to change my prices so frequently, that imposes a lot of cost to us logistically. So that's one cost, and even for moderate inflations can be relatively high. Now another cost is somewhat indirect, which is that as the price level starts to increase, governments are then tempted to stop this by engaging in price controls. So the government effectively creates the inflation, the hyperinflation, by spending more than it can afford. And it pays for this by printing money, which leads to inflation. Now, the government says, well, that's simple. We'll stop the inflation by letting prices increase only by set amounts. So a price control says we're going to set a price ceiling. Right? The price can't go above a particular amount. And so if we think back to our demand and supply, this has very predictable effects. Supply of a good, demand. We would have some equilibrium price. And what we're seeing is that equilibrium price is increasing very quickly with inflation. The government says, well, no. We're going to fix the price down here. We're going to set a price ceiling, engage in price controls. And we know what happens. You get a big shortage. And so that really makes people much worse off. So you take a look at Venezuela, who's had this inflation recently, very high inflation. And the government, in fact, did this, right? They said, well, we're going to impose price controls, price ceilings, that prevent goods from increasing. And what did they get? They got very big shortages, even in essential goods such as food. And so what you see is a lot of malnourishment in Venezuela as a result of these government policies. So this can be very, very harmful depending on the severity of the inflation and depending on the severity of the price controls. This was also tried in the U.S. in the 1970s on gasoline. So the government imposed price ceilings on gasoline because the price of gas was increasing too fast, so they thought. So what happened was you had big shortages of gasoline. So you see these pictures of big lines outside of gas stations, people hoping to get gas, and that's exactly what happened. So these costs can tend to be very large, especially if the inflation is relatively high. So anywhere above 10%, and these policies are going to pop up, and the logistical costs are going to tend to increase. So these are the costs of inflation. We'll then take a look here at any potential benefits that accrue from inflation.